Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute or two while everyone logs into the Zoom. So we'll get started here in just a minute or two. Good morning, everyone, to the webinar. Thank you for joining. We're going to get started here in just a minute. All right, I think most people have logged in. So good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar discussion of an American strategy for Greater Central Asia. I'm Laura Linderman, Director of Programs at the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute at the American Foreign Policy Council, and I'm honored to moderate today's panel. So we are being recorded, so everyone is aware, and we will also allow Q&A towards the end of the discussion. So feel free to use the Q&A button on Zoom to submit any questions. Also, we are going to be discussing a recent paper, An American Strategy for Greater Central Asia. We encourage all of you to subscribe to our Substack, Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, where you can receive this paper and other papers from the Institute as well, and a lot of interesting commentary. So with that, Greater Central Asia is more central than ever. The region spanning from the heart of Central Asia through the South Caucasus and reaching Mongolia and Afghanistan sits at the crossroads of US-China competition, Russian revanchism, European energy diversification, and emerging global trade routes. The choices made here will reverberate through global markets, geopolitics, and the future of sovereignty and independence across Eurasia. The Central Asia-Caucasus Institute has played a long and leading role in shaping U.S. thinking about the region. We were the first to promote the idea of C5+1 platform for U.S. Central Asian engagement, now an established and vital diplomatic framework. Also, nearly 20 years ago, we argued for removing Central Asia and the Caucasus from under the Moscow desk at the State Department, insisting that these independent nations deserve to be treated as such in U.S. foreign policy. In light of the recently proposed reorganization to the State Department, which would alarmingly collapse Russia and the Caucasus back into one office, we are again calling attention to the risks of reverting to an outdated great power-centric framework. Our belief is clear. To engage effectively, the U.S. must adopt a strategy that reflects the region's current realities and aspiration and works with countries, not one that subordinates them to larger neighbors. The paper we're going to be discussing today is an American strategy for Greater Central Asia, and it's the latest CACI contribution to this effort. It proposes an ambitious and pragmatic path forward, grounded in regional sovereignty, connectivity, economic opportunity, and security cooperation. So with that, I am absolutely privileged to introduce our panel today. We have the man who needs no introduction, Dr. Fred Starr, our founding chairman, whose lifelong dedication to Central Asia has shaped our understanding of the region. We have Anders Wimbush, a distinguished fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council and one of the great strategic thinkers in the United States. We have Dr. Svante Cornell, Director of Research here at CACI, and also co-founder of the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm. And finally, Dr. Mamuka Tsereteli, who brings not just his long academic credentials, but real-world experience leading the American Georgia Business Council for over 2 decades, giving him a unique perspective on economic development. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Fred Starr, who will introduce the report and get us started with the framing of the discussion. Fred.
Thank you very much. As Laura Linderman said, the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute is not new to strategic analyses of Central Asia and the Caucasus region. It actually goes back to before 9/11 even. The only paper strategic analysis of Afghanistan and the region that was available at the time of 9/11 was one that we prepared and published and that was widely disseminated by the Defense Department. The region is the question that we're dealing with today. We're not interested in just listing tasks and projects, which unfortunately is what most of the governmental analyses and many think tank analyses focus on. We're really after getting the concepts right. And the concept here is that the region has changed and is changing now before our eyes. How has it changed? Well, initially, it was defined in terms of Soviet definition of Central Asia, which included five Central Asia republics of the USSR. This has been accepted down to the present by Washington. Unfortunately, it's outdated. It's very outdated. It's historically baseless, yet we've persisted with it. It is because of our desire to adapt to current realities that we propose now that this be expanded to C6 plus one, the six being Azerbaijan. This isn't an invention of ours. It's something which all the countries themselves have proposed. They're acting on it, and you see who's attending their meetings. So that's the first thing. Beyond that, however, one could imagine expanding further. Armenia is certainly a candidate as things are developing there, and Georgia potentially at some point as well. Beyond that, as Laura Linderman said, there's the question of Mongolia, and the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute is publishing a major paper by Mongolian analysts and public figures on Mongolia's relationship to Central Asia. I simply point out, if you look at the map, you will see that Mongolia neighbors Kazakhstan with a small passageway, Chinese passageway in between, but they're neighbors really. And it also is neighbor to Xinjiang, the oldest Turkic and Muslim country in the region, now part of China. So expansion goes on, and we want to flag the fact that the Central Asians themselves are already thinking about Afghanistan as not a neighbor of Central Asia, but of a part of Central Asia. So what conceptually we started with in this analysis is an expansion, alteration of the term Central Asia to be Greater Central Asia. And that term we recommend and urge on everyone simply because it reflects reality. It's not a tactical invention on our part. It is a term that describes what is emerging reality. We urge the U.S. government to take various steps, which are covered in the document and which my colleagues will detail area by area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fred, Dr. Starr, for that discussion about enlargement. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Anders Wimbush to talk a little bit about institutions and what we recommend institutionally in the paper going forward.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Fred. As both of you have already argued, let me just begin by saying it's time to give up the illusion that Greater Central Asia is just some hollow space in the middle of a lot of other things that has no strategic importance on its own, that it's connected to nothing else. And as Fred noted, worse still is the belief that Greater Central Asia remains connected inextricably to the former Soviet world. This is an intellectual paradigm that's been dead for a long time. This is generally how Greater Central Asia has been and is currently reflected in U.S. objectives and strategies. This despite the strategic dynamics of Greater Central Asia already affecting everything around it. Greater Central Asia is not some distant appendage of Asia, but attaches Asia to Europe and Russia through energy, trade, transport, and resources. So for the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, and others, Greater Central Asia is a critical variable of their own grand strategies, not an afterthought. If a strategy for pivoting to Asia, as American strategists intend, if that strategy mistakes Greater Central Asia as a distant flank, it will miss opportunities for enhancing the U.S. competitive advantage while encouraging unwelcome strategic surprises on one hand, and it will lose opportunities to thwart the efforts by our adversaries to enhance their interest at the expense of our own on the other. Greater Central Asia, in sum, is central to any pivot to Asia, independent or divorced from it. Now, our strategy recommends a number of ways to build U.S. power and influence without breaking the bank. We understand that the U.S. has many strategic priorities and limited resources, and we believe that gaining considerable advantage for the U.S. in Greater Central Asia is possible at an acceptable cost. And this can be accomplished by good decision-making and strong implementation. Decision-making starts by putting somebody in charge of Greater Central Asian strategy. We have recommended a special presidential envoy for Greater Central Asia. This person should be on the National Security Council, and designing and implementing strategy for Greater Central Asia must be that official's priority, not just some additional responsibility. Similarly, unique analytical and operational groupings at key institutions like the State Department and the Department of Defense and Commerce and Trade should mirror this concentration and be concentrated within it. We recommend a series of specific institutional measures to help define and position U.S. interests within a larger Greater Central Asian strategic framework. And these include, first, focus and attention and resources on aggressively championing the U.S. private sector's interests in the region, which means seeding, stimulating, and multiplying commercial efforts. This is America's sweet spot. Greater Central Asia is a pregnant consumer space with large and growing populations. Our strategy calls for pursuing opportunities for U.S. business and trade, transport, manufacturing, tourism and travel, research, development, and extraction. With regard to rare minerals, Greater Central Asia has many in abundance, though most conversations today focus mostly on China and Greenland. To power this effort institutionally, we recommend that the U.S. government create a Greater Central Asian Business Council, for example, at the Department of Commerce, with representatives in the U.S. and each Greater Central Asian country. As we envision it, this is where cross-border and regional commercial opportunities can be born, where investors can be identified and engaged, where new ideas for commercial development can be cross-pollinated, and where U.S. support can be coordinated. We know from extensive contact with Greater Central Asian business people that the appetite for such an initiative is great. Second, a sound strategy to enhance counterterrorism efforts by encouraging states in Greater Central Asia to closer cooperation is necessary. Aggressive monitoring of this dynamic and close cooperation with the Greater Central Asian states and aggressive counterterrorism is, of course, a key American interest. And as we noted in the strategy paper, Islamic terrorism is sometimes homegrown in Greater Central Asia, while a great deal more is transported across porous borders from states like Iran and Pakistan. as well as through efforts by more distant Middle Eastern Islamic regimes to expand their area of ideological influence and operations. Afghanistan is a dynamic crossroads of both trends, which is why the retreat of US military and security presence there has been particularly harmful. The strategy we propose, which embraces Afghanistan within the organic context of Greater Central Asia, offers an opportunity to impede these trends. Third, a US strategy for Greater Central Asia should include a robust regional security framework. Its purpose is to promote cooperation and coordination and integration among the nation's military and national security professionals. The US military is one of the most effective institutions for engaging foreign security elites, and it has in the past included Greater Central Asian military and security elites in its programs in the institutions we identify in our strategy. These could be expanded and intensified significantly at low cost. These engagement would include developing common security protocols, military ethics, intelligence sharing, joint operations, and technical interoperability. And our strategy suggests a number of ways and places military and national security professionals from Greater Central Asian states can plug into existing US capabilities for very little cost. Influencing these security professionals through contact, training, and cooperation, especially with familiarity through participation in US-led security organizations, will pay significant benefits to them and to us.
Thank you.
Fourth, as part of the regional security framework, our strategy calls for creating a mechanism for cooperating with allies who have aligned or overlapping interest in Greater Central Asia to build a strategic multiplier effect. For example, an assessment and consultative mechanism might include Europe, India, Turkey, Israel, Japan, and perhaps even a few Gulf states. And they are all logical candidates to contribute. The US State Department could lead, and US embassies in the region would serve as conduits for joint thinking and cooperation among allies whose interests in Greater Central Asia align. Fifth, we recommend assisting Central Asian governments to expand their own collective structures by drawing selectively on the experience of other multinational bodies. The aim should be to help Central Asian states build a solid foundation for working together, and importantly, not be held hostage to the collective organizations dominated by Russia or China. I'm sure Svante will have a bit more to say about that in a moment. And sixth, our strategy calls for developing a serious communication strategy for Greater Central Asia, which goes beyond current efforts to simply deliver information into a digital media environment that is saturated with what many competitors say is unbiased information, but which in fact is really narrative warfare that advances their interests while undermining ours. America's government communications efforts, like the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, have often positioned themselves as political opposition voices to Greater Central Asian policies and practices. The current uncertainty about the future of these institutions is an opportune moment to recast a communication strategy that engages young elites in the region in their own languages, but especially in English, which connects them to the larger world of global business and Western ideas and conventions. The objective must be to explain American interests, motives, and visions effectively while exposing the fallacies of those of our competitors as harmful to Greater Central Asian interests. To sum up, pieces of these initiatives have surfaced independently, some might say serendipitously, in various parts of the US government, but they have never been welded into a coherent strategy of their own or attached and aligned with other strategies that seek to enhance US interests. Over the past 3 decades, There have been lots of projects, as Fred noted, projects funded by the US taxpayer, but nothing greater than the sum of its parts has emerged. In the 1990s, this was explicable, perhaps forgivable, because few strategists knew where Greater Central Asia was and what it represented. In 2025, Greater Central Asia can no longer be ignored because it contains significant US interests in Greater Central Asia itself that extend to the states around it. Meanwhile, rare commercial opportunities that can help anchor a strategy are increasingly attractive. To secure these interests and pursue these opportunities, putting a comprehensive strategy in place for Greater Central Asia is the first step. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anders, for that comprehensive overview and sort of very clear-eyed view of the institutional reforms needed and the overall strategy that can be used by the U.S. in the region. So to turn it over to Dr. Svante Kornell, I'd like to ask about how the Caucasus fit into Greater Central Asia. We position Azerbaijan as a core piece of Greater Central Asia, but how does this bridge the South Caucasus with Greater Central Asia in practical terms? And yeah, so maybe you could start with that.
Thank you, Laura. Of course, this is a particular point of interest for the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, since obviously we have in our very mandate the notion that Central Asia and the Caucasus are linked, both intrinsically within the region itself, but even more so in view of the U.S. policies or in U.S. interests, actually. Not always the policies, definitely, but certainly in how U.S. interests across this part of the world should be understood. If we look at this in a broader sense, the obvious reality of Central Asia is that the region is landlocked. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's obviously been a lot of work done in terms of rebuilding the connections between Central Asia and its neighboring regions, particularly, of course, the connections to the east, to the south, and to the west that were historically as important and definitely in the case of South Asia, much more important than the connections, infrastructural trade connections to the north. And what we can see over the past 30 years is that there has been a lot happening, particularly on the China angle of the building of infrastructure, reconnecting Central Asia with China. We know that our friends in Central Asia, particularly in Uzbekistan, are working hard in spite of all the obstacles and problems to reconnect with through Afghanistan to the Indian subcontinent and to the high seas, of course. Very recently, Uzbekistan organized a conference in Termez on the border with Afghanistan, including representatives of the government of Afghanistan, as well as other regional powers, both Central and South Asian, in order to expand on this initiative. But of course, also for the past 30 years, there has been considerable, but not sufficient, work done to connect Central Asia across the Caspian and the Caucasus with Turkey and Europe and the Black Sea. The fact is that for a long period of time, the United States was actually taking a leadership role in this effort. In the 1990s, early 2000s, the US was a driving force in connecting the energy resources of the West Caspian of Azerbaijan through the Caucasus, through Georgia and Turkey into Western markets. The U.S. administrations at the time, both Republican and Democrat, made a strong effort to make sure that Central Asian energy producers were involved from the start in this process. President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan was a participant and a signatory to practically all of the documents, including President Clinton's participation and so on about the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline and other. And obviously this was in line with the U.S. view of an east-west axis, if you will, east-west transportation corridor that would help Central Asia to break out of its geographic isolation. Unfortunately, for at least the past 20 years, neither the US nor the EU really has continued to view or in practice to work on strengthening this link between Central Asia and the Caucasus. In fact, inadvertently, at times, both the US and the EU has worked to weaken this link. And I would say it's obvious that the latest suggestion to change the bureaucratic boundaries within the US government, in particular in the State Department, to put the Caucasus back with Russia makes the situation worse, because bureaucratic distinctions and the way the US government organizes itself actually matters. And we have seen this very clearly in terms of what happened when Central Asia was taken out of the European and Eurasian Bureau back 20 years ago, and instead put with the South Asian Bureau, creating the Bureau of Central and South Asia. This was definitely something that our institute supported at the time, because Central Asia was very much a forgotten part of the huge Europe-Eurasia Bureau that didn't get the attention it deserved. But the inadvertent, consequence of this was that basically all talk, or definitely every action within the US government about the connection between Central and South Asia, for all practical purposes, ceased once the people working on Central Asia and on the South Caucasus were in different bureaus, different offices, different floors of the State Department, if you will. This is just a simple bureaucratic reality. These distinctions matter. The way people work together or don't work together matters. And if people working on the South Caucasus are now going to be the people working on Russia, that's not going to help US interests in this region. It would make a lot more sense to connect, to basically put Central Asia, to put the South Caucasus together with Central Asia, or join, if you will, Central Asia to the Bureau where Central Asia is currently the South and Central Asia Bureau. And I think if this current proposal goes through, it's going to have to be rethought. I can't see how this would in the long term serve the US interest, but if it happens, it definitely means that the US will lose time. Again, if bureaucratic boundaries are to be redrawn, we see the reality being that the South Caucasus is, if you will, neither Europe, neither Central Asia, nor the Middle East, but it's also both European, Central Asian, and Middle Eastern, to different degrees depending on the different countries. But what should be the guiding light for US policy is how a bureaucratic division of the world makes sense from the point of view of US policy. And here it's very obvious at this point that linking the Caucasus to Central Asia is what makes most sense from an American policy perspective. Obviously, there are people in this region that see themselves as more European than Central Asian, if you will. You're definitely going to hear that in certain parts of Georgia and Armenia. But the reality is that in the European Bureau of the State Department, the South Caucasus remains, just like Central Asia was, a forgotten part that doesn't get the time and attention it deserves, and doesn't really connect to all the other priorities that are at the top of the attention, if you will, of the leadership of that bureau. In that sense, I think it would make a lot more sense from the point of view of US interests to put the Caucasus together with Central Asia. Now, Laura asked specifically about Azerbaijan and the role Azerbaijan plays. I think it's been clear in the past several decades that Azerbaijan has emerged in this context of the South Caucasus as a middle power. We've published about this 2 years ago or so, a paper about the rise of middle powers in Central Asia and the Caucasus. Obviously, together with the emergence of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan as middle powers in Central Asia. So in Greater Central Asia now we have 3 middle powers, and it makes obvious sense for the US to anchor its relationship with this part of the world and work with the middle powers, not at the expense, of course, at the smaller and weaker countries of the region. But the point about the middle powers, and in this context specifically about Azerbaijan, is the agency that these states have in terms of helping shape the region that is around them, and not just being shaped, if you will, by the great powers that are surrounding this region. And especially as these 3 powers put together and start working together much more actively than they have in the past, We see this, for example, there's a long-standing relationship between Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan that came to be in large part as a result of common interests in the energy sphere. By the way, similar to the way Azerbaijan and Georgia started working together in the 1990s. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan more recently have developed their relationship very deeply, not only at first in terms of a strategic partnership, but now also as a formal alliance between these two states. And we see even more recently in the past 2-3 years, especially how Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan have deepened their relationship in everything from energy issues to the economic and trade cooperation to defense and defense industrial issues. What we see now is the development of trilateral cooperation between Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, as well, of course, as a broader regional cooperation involving smaller powers in Central Asia, where the Azerbaijanis are increasingly becoming part and parcel of this process. It is obvious that the region sees itself that way. The Central Asians increasingly see Azerbaijan as part of the region. Azerbaijan has made it clear that it sees itself very much as part of Central Asia, not at the expense of it being, in the close proximity of both Turkey and Iran, but that is definitely one important vector in Azerbaijani foreign policy. And if we look at it from the perspective of the coherent strategy in view of the region that Ender spoke of, this is the reality on which we have to base our policy. And the reality is also that there are partners, potential and real partners that the US can work with and anchor its policy across this region, because for the very simple reason that the middle powers not only have an interest, but actively are courting outside powers like the United States, like Europe, Japan, India, and others, that help them, if you will, create a more multilateral, a broader international environment in the region that prevents the domination of the region from some combination of Russia and Iran. Let me stop there, and I'll be happy to continue on this topic or other if there are questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Svante. Actually, before I turn it over to Dr. Mamuka Tsereteli, you really covered the core of Greater Central Asia with the middle powers. Maybe could you say a word or two about a bit more about the periphery, Afghanistan and Mongolia?
Well, of course, this all depends on the issues that you are talking about and the time perspective that we have at hand. For many practical purposes, we are talking about Central Asia and Azerbaijan at first, because this is where the action is today. But we can't, be behind the 8 ball, if you will, all the time. We have to look to the future and help, if you will, the countries in the region develop what's the next step, what's over the next hill, if you will. It's hard to do that because there are so many challenges and threats in the region, all from what the Russians may or may be doing, to the activities of the Chinese, to what's happening with Iran and Afghanistan and so on. But if we take the example of Uzbekistan and its policy towards Afghanistan, there is a clear view here. The clear view is that in order for this region to prosper, the main trade route that existed in the past has to be rebuilt. It's a very pragmatic policy. I don't think there is a lot of love lost for the Taliban regime anywhere in Central Asia, but there is a reality that the Taliban are in power and are likely to be in power for some time. That means that especially in an environment where you're being squeezed in a sandwich, if you will, between the Russians and the Chinese, you have to somehow work with whoever is in power in Afghanistan, as long as they are not a direct threat to your interest and to your security. This is definitely how most of the Central Asian, actually by now all of them, until recently Tajikistan was more skeptical, but I think recently we see a consensus among Central Asian states that we have to work with whoever is in power in Afghanistan. We have to help develop Afghanistan. We have to help the economy of Afghanistan develop, because just by isolating Afghanistan, we are not going to achieve any results that are in the interest either of the Afghan people or of the Central Asians. Obviously, the fact that the Taliban are in power, they were the ones creating instability in the past when the US and the US supported government was there. But it's a reality that trade through Afghanistan is now is easier than it was in the past. The checkpoint situation that existed in the past with various warlords and what have you is not there anymore. The security situation for truck drivers and the like it has improved a lot. That is the experience of the Uzbeks and other Central Asians. And this means that somehow for the region, it is an imperative for Afghanistan to be viewed as part of Central Asia and as a crucial element in how Central Asia becomes prosperous, and also for the security of the region, because economic security in this situation where you are dependent on China and Russia is economic security is very important. The link across the Caucasus, the Caspian and the Caucasus helps. But, the volumes, if you look at the trade volumes and the dependency, particularly on energy exports for the regional states, are still heavily dependent on the Russians. That means that everything you can do to expand both westwards through the Caucasus and southward to Afghanistan are absolutely crucial. That doesn't mean that the main trade of Central Asia in the next 5 years is going to be through Afghanistan, but you have to start somewhere and you have to work for this to be a reality going forward. Mongolia is often forgotten as a part of Central Asia. But Mongolia itself views itself increasingly. The commonalities, cultural, political, if you will, at least security-wise, if anybody is squeezed between the Russians and the Chinese, it's obviously Mongolia. But and the fact that they lack a border with Central Asia is a reality, but it's also doesn't mean that Mongolia cannot, as part of its attempts to diversify its international situation, link itself up with Central Asia more. Air traffic is a great example that has enormous potential to be improved. Right now, there is very little air traffic from Mongolia to Central Asia, as those of us who are going to Ulaanbaatar either today or for our CAMCA conference there would know. But also in terms of trade, there are a lot of ways in which Mongolia and Central Asia can learn from each other, their experiences of dealing with their large neighbors, of how to maintain their sovereignty and independence. And obviously, in the case of Mongolia, they have a different political system, which is very interesting. It's a raucous, if you will, and flawed democratic system, but still a system that is more pluralistic than the one we've seen in Central Asia. And I'm sure that in the future, Mongolia is going to be, by necessity, also looking more to Central Asia, just like Afghanistan will, irrespective of who is in charge in that country.
Thank you so much, Svante. Turning to Dr. Mamuka Tsereteli, you're not forgotten. Last but not least, we'd like to hear a bit more on trade, transport, and energy. I know that you were also recently at the IMF meeting, so perhaps also you could give us a bit of color from that as well.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks to all our colleagues, and thanks to our audience for being part of this discussion. I'll be brief because we have many questions, I think, and it's better to answer questions from our audience, but I'll say a few words. I think Greater Central Asia is a very fertile soil for American investments and engagement, commercial and trade engagement. And this fertile soil was created obviously by history and natural history, because they have a lot of minerals and resources there, and also it's a recent history of investments, successful American investments in Central Asia and several Central Asian countries. And this range of investments and sectors of economy is very impressive. It starts from obviously energy, but it expands to many different fields, and recent years, investments in information technology companies, and obviously tourism after opening Uzbekistan and other countries for more engagement for foreign investors and companies. It really it really attracts foreign investors, this entire region. And I think in many ways, American private sector representatives are ahead of American government in terms of going into region, looking at opportunities there. But obviously, what we want to see is a more complementarity in private sector activities, as well as government support and U.S. clarity in U.S. strategy towards the region. I think Anders, Svante, I think we've discussed already importance of openness and connectivity. This is landlocked region, and access to open seas is very important in a way is important not only for export realization of export potential of this greater Central Asia and utilizing resources of the region and sending commodities to the world markets, but also it's important from the perspective of United States producers from United States as well as Europe and other countries to access markets in this region. Greater Central Asia has one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and as IMF economic outlook demonstrates, many countries have 8-9% annual growth. And as a region, market grows and purchasing power of population is growing, and it's a large potential market for American producers. We should also probably mention that if you look at, let's say, trade and investments between Central Asia and the European Union is the largest investor in Central Asia as an overall European Union, all 27 countries, as well as second largest trade partner, and the US is way behind that. So we see that potential in this region is great. Countries themselves, as I said, invested significant resources and amount of volume of financing of infrastructure development in ports, roads, railroads. It creates opportunities that makes it easy for the region to connect to westward through South Caucasus to Black Sea and Turkey and Mediterranean, as well as Svante mentioned, southward. So these are the, I think, priority areas where region is focused and where opportunities are from US side as well. Multiple points were made about institutional development. I think with the absence of some of the traditional institutions that were engaged in the region, like USAID and others, role and importance of DFC, Development Finance Corporation, is increasing. And I think all the commitments that were made in the past about investments in the region from DFC, they have to be fulfilled. And also, I think new opportunities are opening there. And DFC can be the very significant instrument for advancing US interests. And I think my last point will be that I think private interests and commercial interests of American private companies and US strategic interests in Greater Central Asia go hand in hand. And I think that's where we should have a greater coordination between companies and government. And I think some of the government institutions like Department of Commerce and hopefully down the road, DFC will play a significant role, and they're already playing a significant role in the process. So I'll stop here to allow more questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mamuka. Okay, so I'm going to pose 3 questions from the audience for you all. So listen up while I try to collect them here. First one is from Robert Cutler. And to read it to you, before Aliyev visited Beijing at the end of April, he signed an agreement for a comprehensive strategic partnership. An idea was circulating in policy circles in Baku to ask NATO to help ensure security on the Trans-Caspian international trade route by extending the NATO Critical Energy Infrastructure Protection Program from energy infrastructure to transportation and supply chain infrastructure. A few weeks before he went to Beijing, however, Aliyev began to use the term Belt and Road Initiative to refer to the Middle Corridor, which was never part of the Belt or Road in the initial Chinese strategic conception. So is there no chance anymore for the West to extend security through the Middle Corridor through NATO? If not, does the US or any European country or the EU have any instrument for such an on-the-ground strategic presence through infrastructural governance? Or is the Chinese imposition of its own normative, infrastructural, and surveillance framework already a fait accompli? So that's question 1. Question 2 is multi-pronged, and the idea is really trying to understand the difference between power brokers and political, institutional, internal political institutions in Central Asia and how that relates to regionalism. So from Saodat Kasimova, Who in Central Asia should we talk to so that the implication of agreements is implemented? Or who has the real power in each specific country? Real power means the decision has been made and will definitely be implemented. Kyrgyzstan can be characterized as follows: the trade roads of a stronger state. Whoever controls custom controls the policy of the state. For example, in Uzbekistan, the weight of Usmanov in political decision-making in Uzbekistan. During the time of Karimov, Usmanov could not come to Uzbekistan. Now he was part of a political visit of the Uzbek delegation to France and was devoted to solving the problems of Usmanov's seized assets. I ask the questions because I want to understand the specifics of the political situation in a specific country and the political vector of the country's future development. And does that provide sufficient conditions for the formation of regional cooperation? And finally, please explain Turkey's instrumentalization of OTS as a soft power tool to attract Central Asian middle powers in the merger of economic corridors, Middle Corridor and BRI. All right, so I'm going to put these into the chat so you can read them again. And I don't know who wants to start us off. So we've got Fred. Did I see a... Oh, you're muted. Fred, you're muted.
First of all, the question of who gets things done in each country is a very important one. It's beyond the scope of this discussion right now, however. Lest we get too pessimistic about this, note that the entire process of creating a greater Central Asia, of linking arms in the region, has been done very effectively by the governments, by the presidents, but now it's filtering down, and they are spreading it to other instruments of other sections of government and even society, with meetings in all sorts of sectors, including medicine, women's rights, so on and so on. So that is a separate matter. On the Turkish question, I just remind you that is Turkic. I don't think an ethnic definition is going to get you very far, because these are fairly diverse countries. It doesn't get you. I mean, what about Tajikistan? What about a good part of Uzbekistan, which is not Turkic? Not to mention Afghanistan. It basically writes you out of the story there. So I think the Turkic initiative is itself positive in that it is bringing people together, but it's bringing them together under a foreign flag rather than under their own flag. And I just note in passing that if it's really Turkic, why are the Turks ignoring Xinjiang?
Thanks, Fred. Svante, Enders, Mamuka, any comments on Turkey, on Belt and Road and its strategic implications, or internal political
Laura, let
machinations?
me pick up on the security question. I'm not
Sure.
sure I understood it all, but I think it's important to emphasize one thing which is utterly critical. The United States is not going to put any boots on the ground in Central Asia. None. The retreat from Afghanistan effectively ended that. I think it was a mistake precisely for this reason, because of the impact of those small number of troops in the region around, and how it could have affected the strategies of everyone else in the region. That means that the kind of strategy that we're proposing has to be fully comprehensive. It has to be strong on all its individual elements, and it has to be driven with some sense of mission by the National Security Council or the other organs of U.S. government.
Thank you. Yeah, good point.
If I could just chime in on the issue of the first question on NATO and China, I think the reality that is very clear in Azerbaijan from their perspective is that I mean, if you look back a number of years, Azerbaijan has been working very hard to strengthen its cooperation with Euro-Atlantic institutions, in particular with NATO, through the Partnership for Peace, independent action, individual action plans with NATO and so forth. But the reality over the past 10, 20 years is that really starting with the war in Georgia in 2008, Azerbaijan concluded that, well, if the West and the United States is not going to come to the rescue of Georgia and either deter or address the occupation of large parts of Georgian territory by Russia in a very blatant way, the West is not going to come to our assistance either. So while the Azerbaijanis have continued to develop their relationships, hoping for a change in Western policy and a more active involvement and engagement, that has not been forthcoming. In fact, things have gone the other way. And against this background, you see a very strong change in the Azerbaijani foreign policy, which is to raise its involvement in issues in organizations like the non-aligned movement, which sends simultaneously a signal to the Russians that we're not going to join your institutions, but we are not without friends either. Obviously, the bilateral relationship with Turkey has been the absolutely most important one for Azerbaijan. It's now a mutual defense treaty, which kind of funnily has a NATO aspect, because now, we kind of jokingly and only half jokingly say that Azerbaijan is de facto a member of NATO because, it has a mutual defense treaty with a member of NATO. What does that really mean for NATO? I mean, nobody's really asking this question. I think it's a fairly significant question. That being said, I think what the Azerbaijanis are realizing is that they have to branch out and talk to others. Now, it's very interesting how China was not part of the equation in Azerbaijan. If you look still to this day, Chinese investments in ownership of assets in Azerbaijan is basically a non-issue. Even, by the way, it should be mentioned that the large Central Asian states have been very careful, the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs. If you look at the Kyrgyz and Tajik, the situation is different. There is a high level of indebtedness towards China. But the Azerbaijanis have, I think, concluded that, perhaps from learning from the experience of their colleagues in Central Asia, that there is a way of working with the Chinese and having them in a controlled way in the region is definitely something that we should do, particularly when the West is absent. That the Azerbaijan would never have taken this step if they had felt that there was a route, a sustainable and even mildly credible alternative from Western partners. But that's just not happening.
Thank you. Mamuka, anything to add?
No, I would just say that as Fred always liked to call potential of South Caucasus as a corridor connecting Greater Central Asia with Europe and Mediterranean as a land Suez. And meaning of the land Suez is that idea of the land Suez is that you have multiple actors involved in the process of transit, so that they are interested in stability of the region. And I think there's a natural drive. I fully support what Svante said. There's a natural drive among countries of South Caucasus and in Greater Central Asia to have all the actors now present, so that you cannot rely on for security guarantees or any one actor at this point. So you have to have multiple actors interested in commercial and trade and other kind of factors that allow them to at least balance potential threats that may come from some of the major adversaries, which is in this case Russia, of course.
Great. So a couple more questions from the audience. We've got from Sahib Aliyev in Baku, a two-part question. What U.S. support or should U.S. support Trans-Caspian gas pipeline projects? And what the issue on abundant rare earth elements in Central Asia is often around processing capacity. How can the U.S. support processing capacity for rare earth elements in Central Asia? And from our COMCA fellow, Timur, he wants to know, what can we do to get Jackson-Vanik repealed? And I think a question we'd all like to know. We've also got Damyan from Baku as well. One of the most important projects that was left unmentioned was the two-part green energy cable mega project, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Black Sea, Romania, Hungary, Uzbekistan, Caspian Azerbaijan that will carry massive quantities of electricity produced from wind and solar and hydro to the EU. Not only will the project bind the Greater Caspian's 3 keystone states or middle powers to one another even more, but it will also anchor Georgia into the region, especially in the absence of any serious movement towards EU and NATO. At the same time, these megaprojects will also make the EU happy because their demand for electricity will surge in the time ahead, and they're willing to pay more for green electricity than anyone on Earth, which is what will make the megaproject economically viable. Can you comment on whether you see some similar electricity projects being built to feed the Chinese or Indian or Iranian markets? If so, could you say something about geopolitical implications? All right, so I'm going to put these in the chat for everyone to read.
Can I offer a general response?
Yeah, please.
These are all significant questions. They're actually urgent in some cases and should be attended to. We're this morning not focusing on the specific projects that have dominated all discussion up to the present. We're concentrating instead in our strategy on what we can do in the United States to that is in our interest in the region of Greater Central Asia, and this has to be stressed, this is the most important issue. How can the Central Asians themselves strengthen their hand in dealing with all the outside powers? Now, this is the institutionalization of Greater Central Asia. The kind of meetings that are taking place with increased frequency in various sectors, all under governmental supervision and oversight, these are creating structures akin to ASEAN in Southeast Asia. And this is all to the good. Every one of the questions that were just posed here would be more effectively addressed by the people of Central Asia and the United States if the Greater Central Asians had a more effective common structure linking them. I'm not talking about merging of ethnicities or nationalities. That's absurd. I'm not even talking about integration in the old Soviet sense, in which you lose your identity, you lose your individual sovereignty. I'm talking about a second floor, a second story on sovereignty, without which none of the questions, the very important questions that have been raised about electricity, all the other issues, minerals, they're not going to be effectively addressed without that second floor on sovereignty that enables them to act as a group and that enables us to deal with them as a group as well as separate entities.
Well said. Thank you. Does anybody else have?
Yeah, I can comment briefly about this this cable and electricity projects. They are very important, obviously, but I echo what Fred says. We were focusing on policy issues. There are still obviously some technical issues that need to be resolved in terms of World Bank is doing a feasibility study assessment for the flow of Black Sea, how cables, both electricity as well as digital cables, will be placed on the floor of Black Sea and all those technicalities. But potential is great. Investments are ongoing in Caspian Sea, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, obviously in Azerbaijan, even in Georgia now. There are several other new wind farms are developing. And your question, the question from Demjan about other directions of export of electricity, yes. Both Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have great potential for electricity export. There are projects that are developing right now that will be focused on south direction and will supply electricity to neighbors to Afghanistan and maybe beyond. But key is that we were focusing on American strategy overall not specifically internal economic or infrastructure developments of the region, which, as I said earlier, obviously in all the investments by governments of the states themselves, as well as international financial international financial institutions, are creating very fertile soil for U.S. Commercial engagement and development of the clear strategies for the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're reaching the end of the time. So I would like to pose one more question from the audience and also allow you all to have one sum up sentence. So Jeff wants to know, following, and I know Fred has thoughts on this one, following some type of end of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, what do the speakers feel will be Putin's next move in Central Asia, and how should U.S. diplomacy attempt to prevent conflict there? But with that, if you could also maybe mention what should be the main takeaway we want webinar participants to take from this strategy, and what really should be the core point, if you could sum it up in a sentence or less. So we'll start with Fred, and then we'll go to Anders, Svante, and Mamuka. Fred.
The post-Putin era in Russia we're already on the lip of it. It's inevitable. It is a post-Putin generation era in Russia, and Russia is going to be for a generation a greatly weakened state. And I needn't go into that today. It fundamentally changes the situation across Greater Central Asia, and it has been one of the factors encouraging them to move toward greater coordination and institutionalization. The United States should support this institutionalization of Greater Central Asia. We should support it, but not seek to control it in any way. We need to do it by keeping our hands off. I think that's the reality. It's the most important issue. If Greater Central Asia is institutionalized, it'll be much more effective on its own. We will find it a much more effective partner in all sorts of projects, and it will simplify everything.
Thank you so much. Anders.
Yes, I just underline what Fred just said. I think that's exactly right. On Russia, Ukraine, and its effect on Central Asia, my take on this is that Russia has now burnt most of its European bridges. It has no allies left on that side of the wall at all. Russia for the next generation is going to be an Asian question. That's where its friends are. That's where its supplies are. Those are the people that talks to. I don't see that turning around, which makes getting the Central Asian strategy right all the more important, because Russia is now a significant part of the dynamic that's going to take place there. To sum up the webinar, just really three things. The first thing is that a Central Asian strategy should now be unique. It can't be attached to anything else, number one. Number two, the United States has to understand that it has an interest in putting that strategy together. And number three, it needs to explore and investigate the kinds of options that we have suggested as the initial building blocks for such a strategy.
Thank you. Svante.
I think aside from what's already been said, I think the main takeaway is the one about agency, that there's still, for various reasons, is a perception that this is a region that we need to work on rather than with. There's a tendency that you see everywhere, irrespective of party. You've seen tendencies that some people appreciate the need to work with these states. Others want to work with the great powers over these states. That's not the way to go, because first of all, the policies of all the great powers surrounding these regions are fickle. Suddenly they're there, suddenly they're somewhere else. For example, I don't think Iran is going to deal a lot with Central Asia and the Caucasus in the next couple of days, if you know what I mean. A lot of things are happening in areas that are more central to their interests than the Central Asia and the Caucasus are. Whereas in the region, there is an emergence of real states that we can work with. I think that's my main takeaway, and we should not forget that these countries have an inherent interest in working with us, which the great powers surrounding the region do not necessarily have.
Thank you. Mamuka.
I would say very briefly that I think Central Asia, Greater Central Asia region, for its main and dominant U.S. interest to make sure that Greater Central Asia is not controlled, not dominated by any other power, and access to this region, both commercial as well as strategic access, is open, shared, not dominated, and not controlled by anybody. So I think strategy should be serving that purpose, and the U.S. needs to act sooner rather than later on this.
Well said, gentlemen. And with that, thank you all so much for attending our webinar. Please subscribe to our Substack, Central Asia-Caucasus Institute Substack, and we look forward to having you read the paper and send us your comments and feedback at caci@afpc.org. Thank you all again.